My name is Tansi. My name is Dr. Paulette Steeves. I'm Cree Métis. I teach at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and I'm the Canada Research Chair in Healing and Reconciliation, and I'm a Paleo-Indigenous archaeologist. So Indigenous peoples' early histories on Turtle Island have been denied by archaeologists, mainly in America, for over a century. Archaeologists' denial of Indigenous links to the land prior to 12,000 years ago has cleaved First Peoples' links to their homelands and created them as recent immigrants to the Americas. Yet, in many oral traditions, Indigenous people that they say they have been here forever, since time immemorial. Archaeologists often discuss Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere as Asians from Asia, but I like to remind them that Asia did not exist 12,000 years ago, and Asia did not exist as this distinct cultural identifier during the Pleistocene. The first people and their descendants are indigenous to the continents of the Western Hemisphere and have been so for thousands of years. The Western Hemisphere is where their cultures, identities, and lifeways were born. This is where they are from. Clovis people, not first and not a people. Western creations of a fictional cultural group. Despite Western claims of unbiased science with results of archaeological sites supported by solid evidence, there are many archaeological stories that travel around in unending circles of confusion and disagreement and are lacking in data and evidence, like the story of the Clovis people. The only place the so-called Clovis people ever existed was in the wildest imagination of the archaeological mind. So what I have found through my research is that there are actually hundreds or thousands of pre-Clovis or pre-11,000 to 12,000 year before present archaeological sites in both North and South America, and evidence of mammalian migrations between the Western and Eastern hemispheres across millions of years. And researchers are well aware that there are many forms of supporting evidence in every area of research. And when we're seeking answers to questions, it's important to consider all forms of evidence and to weave a story based on a holistic view and practice. So the existence of stories on the land, archaeological sites older than 12 to 15,000 years before present, and ancestral connections between ancient and first peoples and contemporary Indigenous communities are empowering to Indigenous people. The existence of hundreds of ancestral sites in the Pleistocene creates a dialogue from which Indigenous people can challenge erasures of their history and their links to the land. It foregrounds their Indigenous identities and their links to the land and empowers them in seeking justice. So these maps show just a few of some of the hundreds of sites that I've collectively documented and created a database for in North and South America. And you can see the sites are scattered from north to south and east to west of both continents. What did the continent look like 12,000 to 24,000 years ago when people supposedly first migrated here? A recent paper came out discussing a 3-mile-high wall of ice along the Bering landmass. This was not a time for anyone, mammals or humans, to be migrating between Eastern and Western hemispheres. What did it look like 2 million years ago? It was a wide open landmass with subtropical forest and a land connection between the Eastern and Western hemisphere. And there's a solid paleontological record that tells us that mammals were migrating across millions of years during this time. So this was a viable landscape for mammals and humans. What did the Eastern Hemisphere look like 2 million years ago? Early hominids were in Asia over 2.1 million years ago, and early humans in Northern Asia. So we're supposed to believe that even though early hominids and early modern humans were in Northern Asia, and they had walked over 14,000 miles from Africa, that they got to Northern Asia and stopped when the mammals were coming and going? That's absurd. It makes no sense whatsoever. Yet, this is the archaeological story that the majority of American archaeologists insist is a fact. What are some of the mammals we know that were migrating between the East and the West? Well, you can see in this picture in the sky, we have Canadian geese because this is Ellesmere Island. Camelid remains were found on Ellesmere Island that date to 3.5 million years ago. We know that camelids arose in the North Americas. We know that horses arose in the Americas. We know the saber-toothed tiger basal species is from Americas. We know that all these species migrated around the world. So we have a lot of proof of intercontinental landmass connections. So to complete my research, I traveled a road through my own connections to the land and the impacts of cleaved and disrupted connections to place and past. I came to understand that political and social disparities, including high rates of suicide among Indigenous populations, are intimately tied to historical, anthropological, and archaeological knowledge production of dehumanization and erasure. Prehistoric archaeology as practiced upon Indigenous cultures is founded upon and underwritten by a series of deep-seated colonialist and negative representational tropes of Indigenous people developed as a part of European philosophies of imperialism over the last 2,500 years. Discourses on the histories of Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, historically framed in Eurocentric archaeological conjecture, are more a product of powerful ideologies based in a colonial past than they are of the known archaeological record. The historically embedded boundary of recent post-late glacial maximum timeframes for first migrations to the Western Hemisphere is not simply based on the archaeological record, but it is a political construct maintaining power and control over Indigenous heritage, material remains, and history. Healing and reconciliation will take a lot of work, not just for Indigenous communities. The biggest piece of the work must be undertaken by settler communities, governments, businesses, and educational institutions. In processes of healing and reconciliation, settler communities need to inform and reframe their worldviews of Indigenous people. There is no easy quick fix program, and there are barriers to reframing the past. Reclaiming and rewriting deep Indigenous history and relinking Indigenous peoples to their ancient homelands is a path to healing for Indigenous people. Understanding Indigenous peoples' links to homelands in the deep past leads to decolonizing minds and hearts and informs and addresses racism and discrimination in contemporary populations.